Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com, another edition of IndieSponge with
Kevin Jagernauth.
Kevin. Today would have been technically day number 4 at the Cannes Film Festival, RIP RIP. As you could see, I'm honoring their previous edition behind me. News at the onset of this week, late last week, we had City go into what he's calling a Cannes Hors les Murs Festival edition, which is called Beyond the Walls. So yeah, it looks like Cannes 2020 is officially canceled, but they're thinking of pairing up with several film festivals. So let's first dig into what that means for the other film festivals, not only what it means for Cannes.
Sure. I think the Cannes Film Festival is it kicks off the whole season. So I think this is really good news for the other festivals that they'll collaborate with because selections that can usually follow into particularly into Toronto and New York and Venice a little bit. So it'll be nice to see that kind of like familiar sort of passing the torch, if you will, to sort of give these films the momentum they would have normally had in a regular year.
So the day before that City interview dropped, Said Ben Said actually dropped some news of his own, saying that Paul Verhoeven's next feature would be pushed back to 2021. And so this sort of like gave us a sense that, okay, some titles will not be identified. They will indeed be pushed to 2021. And they would have been selections for this year's Cannes if you were there as we speak. So let's first talk about the commotion around that. I read in a separate article that they're talking about putting that stamp on about 50 titles. Wes Anderson was included in that. So yeah, talk about that headache or that pivot for 2021 titles and not wanting to identify themselves.
Um, uh, it's an interesting thing, and I think we talked about this previously, where a lot of these films that were going to be in the Cannes selection for at the festival this year, had it happened, um, the the reason they kind of like the reason why Verhoeven's Benedetta and Nadav Lapid's new film and Bruno Dumont's new film are being held back is if they don't have a place in the theatrical calendar anymore to debut, the benefit of sort of like a Cannes selection stamp and a sort of virtual premiere is lost. Like they don't have that momentum to drive their theatrical release. Or in the case of Paul Verhoeven, his kind of movies, they need that buzz of the Palais. Um, they need that sort of like reaction and argument and debate between the press about what it is and what it means and what's controversial. So I understand we're going to see a lot of films follow that lead and sort of wait and try and get into the Cannes lineup next year. Well, let's talk about what films we might expect to get the Cannes 2020 stamp of approval. What do you see as the films that might get Thierry's tip of the hat for this year?
So aside from, I think the Pixar title that was divulged by himself, as far as the same applies to Wes Anderson. Um, they named 50, so there's a lot of titles that normally would have been identified for like the Un Certain Regard section. My feeling is that, let's say, a Sean Durkin film, which previously was at Sundance, would get that second international push. It's very possible because he had premiered Martha Marcy May Marlene there in 2011, I believe, or like a See in France type film. Things that would have had an international premiere could be part of that label. I'm also thinking that it's easy to give that label to films that don't necessitate that critic approved crowd. So Nanni Moretti from Italy has his film, but then we have a Tai Joe, and we had Hanson Love, who had Bergman's Island that was stamped for a summer release. Now that's been pushed back. Um, will they wait for Berlin? I think that they might actually do the same and wait it out for 2021. It's we'll see. But I think that stamp is on titles that were like sort of like certain bets and already have some pathway into showcasing at other film festivals. So, French Dispatch for sure will be hearing about it if Telluride does happen, or New York Film Fest, or even TIFF. Those are that stamp is helpful, um, but yeah, there's a whole bunch of case studies with all these separate titles. Like Tai Joe for sure is going to wait till 2021.
Yeah, I think the other wrinkle here is one of the qualifying factors that was laid out is that and the films that are going to be in this, whatever the selection is, um, Thierry said something along the lines of like, these are films that are planned for a theatrical release between now and spring 2021. I don't know how much that's going to hold. I mean, it's widely expected that Spike Lee's new film, To Five Bloods, is going to hit Netflix with the Cannes logo on it
For sure.
at the front of the film. So I think it'll be interesting to see. I think we're going to see probably more American films than usual. Like if I'm making a couple wild swings, I would assume that David Lowery's Green Knight might sneak into the lineup, where ordinarily it might be in a certain regard title or out of competition in a normal year. Sofia Coppola's film, I could see again, like jumping into the list. So I think it'll be an interesting list because I think we're going to see the parameters of what constitutes a selection open up a bit.
For sure. And so that list they mentioned, I think it's mid or early June. So we'll be curious as to what those 50 titles will be. I imagine that there's going to be a lot of Cannes classic titles that might be incorporated in that out of comp things. But as far as like a very small national cinema title from God knows where, Turkey or Iran or Guatemala, I don't think we'll be seeing those. And we'll see perhaps maybe half of the comp being identified. What I'm curious about is if Netflix, we might be seeing some Netflix titles there. The next topic. So it was announced this week, as film nations are starting to like think about film production and start getting back to business. Obviously, some of the Asian countries are at they're stepping into that as we speak. So good news out of all this mess is that Wong Kar-Wai is actually delving into the On Off Again Blossoms project. So that's really encouraging. So what were your impressions about hearing that news? And also, it's worth mentioning that Wong Kar-Wai would probably have been filming in March and taking a small break to come to Cannes to show off the 4K restoration of In the Mood for Love. So what does it say about filmmaking conditions, and what can we learn from this production?
I mean, we are seeing productions open up in different pockets. So we have, I believe, Spain is opening up, and Iceland, South Korea, some other European countries as well. I mean, for me, it's just thrilling to know that Wong Kar-Wai is finally going to get production mounted. But like anything else in this time, like who knows if it'll be delayed again if there's another wave of infections or whatnot. Um, and the other thing is too, it's like it's great that we have another film from him, but as we know, his productions take a long time. So it could be a while before we see the film. The other intriguing element is that he's working. So the film Blossoms is based on a book, and so he's working on the feature film, but he's also producing a television series version of the same material. So it'll be interesting to see how these two projects complement each other, if they'll be related at all. Um, but either way, it's exciting that we have, essentially two new projects from the director. So, and I guess Restored in the Mood for Love to hold us over for now until we see it. So good
Yes.
times.
What is interesting about this specific project is if you go into the nuts and bolts of it, it's during two time periods. It presents a Shanghai of before and a Shanghai of after, but via a pathway that where we go into the U.S. So perhaps this filmmaker who has no issue in working in with long lapses. We know the stories between 2046, the Grandmaster as well, and he took his Malick-like time to dig into the editing process and the post process. But it'll be interesting to see at what juncture, the U.S. is probably not going to open up for a while, and so I'm curious to see how that'll be put into place.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I think everyone is eager to get back to work, but it also, the other thing to think about is the conditions in place. What does it mean for the kinds of films that can be made? If the sets have to be small, does this mean that we're going to see a boom in the kind of mid-budget, smaller dramas and things that have sort of been siphoned out of the studio system? Are they going to invest in those now because they can't get like 500 Avengers together on a set? Who can say? So it'll be interesting. But
So
again, it's all contingent on just the health of humanity, essentially. So um, cautiously optimistic, but we can't really take it for granted either.
So, in the span of less than 7 business days, Cate Blanchett has been mentioned and attached to 3 projects. So, A-list actors have a lot of time on their hands. They're looking at a lot of screenplays, or they're making bad lasagna projects like Pattison is. But anywho, um, it's actually quite encouraging in terms of where she's leaning to. So she's on board the new Adam McKay film, which will perhaps test her more comedic skills. Maybe it's a politicized project, I'm not really sure. And she's got that video game adaptation that was mentioned last week. But of course, we're drawn to anything that's James Gray. Seeing that you're part of the playlist team, the playlists have their pulse on everything James Gray, Steven Soderbergh, so what were your initial reactions at seeing this A-list actress being curtailed or grabbed by James Gray?
It's exciting. I mean, unexpected because James Gray's next film, which is going by the equally interesting title Armageddon Time, is going to be set in the 70s in the New York um, school system, private school system, I believe. Um, so it's really different territory for James Gray that we than usual. Um, and it'll be interesting to see what role Cate Blanchett has in this story, which will have sort of the Trump family as like sort of an overarching um, mood to the story because Fred Trump was on the board of trustees at the private school James Gray went to, which is sort of like fueling some of the story here, some of this semi-autobiographical story. So yeah, again, like I'm always excited for James Gray's films. So it'll be really, really interesting to see what she brings to the table.
I was looking back at his filmography, and obviously there's that connection with Brad Pitt, his last film Ad Astra, and Brad worked with Blanchett on Babel and The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. So there is that little stars aligned connection. It's his eighth feature, as I said. And when I'm looking at the protagonists of his films, there's almost an equal split, 50-50 split, where he feels as comfortable with strong female leads, thinking back to The Immigrant, or his last two films, with Pitt, and then there's the Lost, forget the title, but
Lost City of Z.
yeah. So I find it kind of interesting that he's able to, I don't know, like put himself in a whole bunch of people's shoes.
Well, I think it speaks to, he just writes compelling lead characters. So I believe actually Cate Blanchett will be playing the principal of the school in this story. And James Gray's, one of his real strengths is that his protagonists are complex, they're flawed, they go on journeys that are very emotional, very human. So um, I'm very curious to see what kind of pathway Cate Blanchett's role will have in the story, which really is set in a context of a very privileged system, a very privileged school that will be portrayed here.
Mm-hmm. With that, we move along to our next headline. So it was announced yesterday that Universal, they have the rights to this project because they made I think the last two versions of the film, and haven't had much success in finding the right fit. So yeah, the big spoiler news is that Luca Guadagnino is going to remake Scarface. So yeah, like Luca's tied to so many projects as we speak. Blood on the Tracks, that's the Dylan project. Burial, Lord of the Flies remake, via the book, I believe, and then Find Me, which is the Call Me by Your Name sequel. So what was your instant reaction to this film news? It seems like two very odd properties, a filmmaker and a gangster film.
Honestly, my first reaction is uh, good luck if this ever gets made, to be honest. This remake has been kicking around Universal for years. So prior to Luca Guadagnino, the filmmakers attached have been David Ayer, David Yates, Pablo Larraín for a spell, Antoine Fuqua. His version was going to be made with Diego Luna. It was scheduled to film, I believe, 2 years ago, and then fell by the wayside. And the script, everyone's excited that it has a script by the Coen brothers, but I think a lot of people are forgetting that their version comes after Paul Atanasio and Terrence Winter also did drafts. So my gut feeling is that we're going to see yet another draft of the script, which means studio executives will have to sign off on it. So this could be in development for another spell of time. If it gets made, great. I'm not holding my breath.
So potentially 2025. I amusingly mentioned, I tweeted out that this would be a vehicle for Tilda. So I was calling it Tanya Montana or Antonella Montana.
That's a good point. We can at least expect something unexpected in how he approaches it. But whether or not that sort of unique take is what a major studio wants to do with a very valuable property is, again, I don't see that they're willing to do anything too outside of the box, which again leads me to suspect that he'll have a great time crafting his version, and then they'll move on to someone else. We'll just give them the shoot 'em up gangster movie they want.
I'm sort of hoping that when Michael Mann took over Miami Vice, I'm hoping for something like that, where it's a huge property, and then you have somebody who just like wouldn't necessarily think fits the part, but then oh yeah, it makes sense. I was certainly thinking about how this might look, how this might sound like, or even smell like, seeing that Luca's cinema is very sensorial, and yeah, I could imagine like long shots and yeah, all of a sudden Tony Montana was wearing a business suit a la Tilda. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, perhaps, but I mean, the flip side to that coin, I know I'm being very cynical here, but Miami Vice was a big, expensive flop too. And it wasn't, I don't think it was what the studio expected either. And so, particularly nowadays when more and more money and more executive jobs are riding on the line of a property doing well, again, I mean, I would love to see Luca's gangster movie. I don't know if this is going to be the one that hits it.
well put. And this week would have been the type of weeks where we see a lot of projects get pitched on the Croisette, where sales for international companies put out these titles and pitch up tent on many projects. Some of them never get made, but in the case of George Miller, Cannes 2015, if I stand corrected, you can correct me on this, Kevin, was a big year for him. It was a big relaunch year for him. Obviously, I'm talking about Fury Road. This week, we have the cool New York Times article, which delved more into the production highs and woes of that film. But we also had back-to-back pieces on two productions. One that was sort of delayed, but one that comes out from the hat with the rabbit and whatnot, the magician's hat. So before talking about the project that sort of was delayed, let's talk about the legacy of Mad Max.
Sure. I mean, it was like a bolt of lightning. I think as what's remarkable about the New York Times piece is I think everyone knew at the time how difficult that production was. But the New York Times piece really, I mean, one of the revelations for me is that George Miller essentially went into editing without the beginning or end of the film. And it was only when the new studio chief came in that he was allowed to go back and shoot and do, I think, 3 more weeks of shooting to get all the stuff in the Citadel, which sort of frames the whole movie. So it sort of reinforces what a little bit of a miracle that movie is in terms of studio blockbusters. It's something special and unique that has a real message, but also is just still a phenomenal piece of just visceral filmmaking. There's really nothing else like it.
So yeah, so on that, he's able to get that confidence to then return to this world, get the money that he needs, and make I don't want to say a smaller version, but more pronounced character study on the character that Charlize Theron had played.
Yeah, so he's spoken about this over the past few years about how he wanted to do a movie centered around Furiosa, and now it looks like he's pivoting towards a prequel. But before he gets there, the first thing on his plate is 3,000 Years of Longing, the project, which also has been kicking around for a little bit, but has Idris Elba and Tilda Swinton attached to star.
So yeah, so that project will begin shooting potentially fairly soon in Australia, where the conditions are somewhat more favorable to, I guess, social distancing and being on perhaps a smaller set. I'm not sure what the scope is for this, but the production will take place there, and it's supposedly supposed to go to London and Istanbul. So we'll see how that pans out. It's not obvious for to have a production go from one country to another, let alone one continent to another. But yeah, not much is known about this, but MGM is willing to throw in what could be some considerable money.
Yeah, it'll be again. George Miller has been playing it pretty cagey about what the film is. He wants to sort of want audiences to experience it fresh. But around the time of Fury Road, when that film was out and he was doing press, he mentioned a couple things which might inform this film. One is that he said he wanted to make a film that was contemporary in setting and had a smaller scale that wasn't as involved as something on the scale of Fury Road. And another thing he said was that he really admired Tangerine, actually, the film by Sean Baker. And he was inspired to do something on that sort of like intimate level. So it'll be interesting to see if 5 years on, that's still the mindset he has for this film.
Moving into more Cannes auteur filmmakers, this week we got three huge filmmakers attach themselves to various series projects. We have Olivier Assayas, who's returning to some familiar material. We have Paul Verhoeven and Sofia Coppola, each being tapped for different projects. For Olivier Assayas, he's actually going back with the support of A24 into a series. So Carlos technically was a feature film, but the way a lot of people saw it was through the lens or scope of a series. And he's going to revisit Irma Vep, like strictly art house film. Not that easy to digest for non-auteur cinephiles, if you will. So yeah, what are your feelings about that film being enlarged or put in a larger canvas?
It's exciting. For me, the curious part is the collaboration between Olivier Assayas and A24. Um, that's an exciting um, duo of talent
Mhm.
and a company that has a very keen eye on auteurs. And Olivier Assayas is certainly no newbie. He's very well respected and established and beloved. So it's exciting to see them put their support behind him. And Carlos showed that he can tell like a story on an expansive canvas that spreads out over multiple hours. So it's great news. It's cool to see him move into this medium again, and if he's inspired to tell a story that he's ventured into before, but with more detail, with other avenues to go down, then I'm for it. I'm very excited.
And in the case of the Verhoeven project, obviously we know that Benedetta has been finished for a while. Paul Verhoeven had some not health issues, but he had to get surgery midway, so that's why we didn't see it in Cannes 2020. So that's very much in the can. So Ben Sayed again is reteaming with the filmmaker on material that's been recently adapted. Like Robert Pattinson was on board as Bel Ami, I believe, the
Mm-hmm.
official title. Any ideas as to uh, um, Verhoeven going back to a terrain that he did in the late 70s?
Wait, he did this in the late 70s?
No, he did. He did a series. The last series he did was in the 70s, the late 70s.
Oh, TV series, yes. Well, I mean, so yeah, he's going back to a medium he hasn't been involved with in a while. And he's tackling a classic French novel that has been brought to the big screen at least 5 times, I believe,
Mhm.
and has already had a couple TV versions as well. So, but all of that said, uh, none of them have had Paul Verhoeven's touch. So, again, like he's a filmmaker who's in the past few years has he's in a bit of a renaissance period. He seems newly invigorated with some really exciting ideas, and so great. Like, sign me up. I'm in.
Yeah, certainly Elle had a big impact on this the later stage of his filmography. And Sofia Coppola would have been in Cannes with On the Rocks. and now she's getting into a new terrain as well. When I think of Coppola, I don't think of series. I really, she's very singular and like, you know, films that fit in a box. And I don't know if that's the right terminology I want to use, but now she's working on something from yesteryear, The Custom of the Country Apple. What are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I don't think it's too far removed from the kind of stories she wants to tell. I mean, this is from what I understand, a kind of a coming of age story. It's set among the sort of New York City elite of the early 1900s. So it's not unfamiliar territory for Sofia
Mhm.
Coppola. Obviously, a series is a new thing, but if anything, it's evidence that her collaboration with Apple on the Rocks has been fruitful. That clearly the studio and her are getting along, and they see eye to eye. So it's really good news. And I think again, like having a bigger canvas to play on. If she has a, if it's a nice place to be if you're a storyteller. And the source material by Edith Wharton. I mean, the author has been behind, you know, the a beloved American author who's been behind The House of Mirth, Age of Innocence, some really iconic stories in the
Mhm.
past as well. So I think it's a winning combination all around.
So that's it for this week. There's probably going to be a lot of film project news next week. And then we're going to be seeing the Cannes Film Festival market in June. So we'll probably get more of this stuff, more production news, more packaging. So it's encouraging to have something to look forward to for the not so distant future, I hope. So thanks for watching, everybody. Thanks to you, Kevin.
Thank you.
And see you next week, guys. Hi, I'm Eric Lavallée. I'm editor-in-chief and site owner for IONCINEMA.com. And this is
Kevin Jagernauth, contributing writer for the playlist.
And together we are IndieSponge.